There is a place in the mountains of southwestern Iran where the wind has not changed in 3,000 years. It still moves the same way it did when the world was younger, slow and dry across stone ridges, through narrow valleys where rivers run thin, over flatlands where nothing grows tall enough to cast a shadow. This is the land where one of the greatest stories in human history began. But when it began, nobody was watching. Nobody cared. And that is the part most people were never told, that the empire which would one day swallow the known world started in a place the known world had already forgotten. Around 700 years before the Common Era, the ancient world had already chosen its main characters. In the river valleys of Mesopotamia, the Assyrian Empire ruled with a kind of cruelty that is almost impossible to understand today. Assyrian kings did not simply defeat their enemies, they made examples of them. They skinned captives alive and nailed their flesh to the walls of conquered cities. They stacked human heads into pyramids at the gates of towns that resisted. They carved these scenes into stone reliefs and displayed them proudly in their palaces, not as warnings but as advertisements. This was the language of power in the ancient Near East. If you wanted to rule, you had to be willing to destroy not just armies but the memory of anyone who stood against you. And for over a century, Assyria spoke that language louder than anyone else. To the south, Babylon was stirring, ancient, proud, and hungry to reclaim the glory it had once held under Hammurabi. Egypt, far to the west along the Nile, was a fading giant, still rich, still beautiful, but no longer the force that had built the pyramids and terrified its neighbors. These were the empires that filled the maps, the names that merchants whispered in marketplaces, the powers that decided who lived and who vanished. And somewhere far to the east, in a stretch of high plateau and jagged mountain ranges that none of these empires considered worth conquering properly, there were tribes. Just tribes. The people who lived on the Iranian plateau were not one nation. They were dozens of scattered groups, Medes in the north, Persians in the south, and countless smaller clans in between, all loosely connected by language, by customs, and by a shared understanding of the world that was quietly unlike anything else in the ancient Near East. They raised horses on the highland plains, and they were extraordinary riders not for sport, but because survival demanded it. The distances between settlements were vast, the terrain was unforgiving, and the threats were constant. Raiding, tribal war, and the ever-present pressure of larger empires pushing at their borders meant that every generation grew up knowing how to fight, how to move fast, and how to endure. But there was something else, something harder to see from the outside. These people carried a moral code that went deeper than law. They valued truth. Not truth as an abstract idea, but truth as a practice. Lying was considered one of the worst things a person could do. They honored fire, not as a god but as a symbol of purity, of the force that separated light from darkness. They believed the world was a battleground between good and evil, and that every person, no matter how small, had a role to play in that fight. These ideas would later be shaped into the religion known as Zoroastrianism, but in these early centuries they were not yet a formal faith. They were something more powerful, they were instinct. They were the air these people breathed. The Medes were the first among these Iranian tribes to organize into something resembling a kingdom. Under their king, they built a capital at Ecbatana, and for a time they were the dominant force on the plateau. The Persians, further south in the region called Parsa, lived in the shadow of their Median cousins, subordinate, taxed, and largely overlooked. Among the Persian tribal leaders, there was one family whose name would eventually be spoken in every language the ancient world knew. They were called the Achaemenids. But in the 7th century before the Common Era, they were nothing. Minor chieftains governing a minor people in a minor corner of a world that did not know their name. They paid tribute to the Medes. They kept their heads down. They survived. No ancient chronicler wrote about them. No great empire feared them. They were invisible, and in that invisibility, in that long silence among the mountains and the dust and the firelight, something was taking shape, something patient, something that would, within a few generations, make the entire world tremble. But not yet. For now, there was only the wind, the waiting, and a family called Achaemenid, whose time had not yet come, but was coming all the same. In the ancient world, kings did not fear armies the way they feared dreams. An army you could see coming. An army moved across plains, kicked up dust, and gave you time to prepare. But a dream came in the dark, uninvited, and it spoke in a language that no general could fight. And so when Astyages, the king of the Medes, the most powerful ruler on the Iranian plateau, woke from his sleep one night drenched in cold terror, it was not because an enemy had crossed his borders, it was because he had seen something in his mind that he could not unsee. The ancient Greek historian Herodotus, writing more than a century later, recorded what that dream contained. Astyages saw a vine growing from the body of his daughter, Mandane. It started small, curling upward like any vine might, but it did not stop. It spread across the land, over the mountains, through the valleys, until it covered the whole of Asia in its shadow. When the king woke, he called for his priests, the Magi, the holy interpreters of the Zoroastrian tradition, and demanded an answer. The Magi did not comfort him. They told him the truth as they understood it. The vine was a child. Mandan would bear a son, and that son would grow to overthrow the Median throne and take everything Astyages had built. The king believed every word. What happened next reveals something about power that has been true in every century since. When a ruler feels threatened not by what exists, but by what might exist, the response is almost always the same. Destroy it before it grows. Astyages had already married Mandane to a Persian vassal chieftain named Cambyses, a man of the Achaemenid family, a minor noble from a minor tribe, someone Astyages considered so beneath him that the marriage was almost an insult by design. A daughter of the Median king wed to a Persian herder chief was no threat, or so he believed. But when the dream came, even that calculated decision felt dangerous. And when Mandane became pregnant, the fear became unbearable. Astyages gave an order. The child, when born, was to be killed, not exiled, not hidden, killed. He entrusted this task to a man named Harpagus, one of his most loyal nobles, a member of the inner court who had served the king for years. Harpagus was told to take the baby and make sure it never drew breath again. It was a simple command from a king who expected obedience without hesitation. But Harpagus hesitated, and that hesitation changed the course of human history. Whether it was conscience, fear of divine punishment, or a colder political calculation knowing that killing a royal grandchild might one day be held against him, Harpagus could not do it himself. Instead, he passed the task down. He gave the infant to a herdsman, a man named Mithridates, according to Herodotus, a shepherd who lived in the mountains far from the court. The instruction was clear: leave the child in the wild to die. Let exposure and animals do what Harpagus could not. But the shepherd did not obey either. Some versions of the story say his own wife had just given birth to a stillborn child, and when she saw the living baby meant for death, she could not let it go. They kept the boy. They raised him as their own. They told no one. And in the mountain silence, far from thrones and dreams and the politics of terrified kings, a child named Cyrus grew up believing he was nobody. Think about that for a moment. The future founder of the largest empire the world had ever seen spent his childhood not learning statecraft or warfare in a palace, but herding animals in the hills, sleeping on dirt floors, eating what the land provided. He did not know his mother was a princess. He did not know his grandfather was a king. He did not know that his very existence was a death sentence that had been quietly commuted by the mercy of strangers. He was a ghost, a boy who had already been erased from the royal record, a life that officially no longer existed. And yet, even in hiding, something about him stood out. The stories say that other children followed him, that he carried himself with a natural authority that puzzled the people around him, that there was a gravity to him that did not match his station. These are the kinds of details that history often adds after the fact, painting the hero's childhood with signs of future greatness. But beneath the legend, there is a harder truth. Cyrus was shaped by absence. He was shaped by not knowing, by growing up outside the machinery of power, by living among people who had nothing and expected nothing. And that, more than any royal bloodline, may be what made him different from every king who came before him. The moment of revelation when Cyrus finally learned who he was is clouded in myth and competing accounts. Herodotus tells a story involving childhood games and a confrontation that drew the attention of Astyages himself. Other sources suggest that the truth surfaced gradually, through whispers and political maneuvering by those who had kept the secret. What matters is not the exact mechanism, but the weight of the knowledge. Imagine standing in a field you have known your entire life and being told that the king who rules everything you can see tried to murder you before you could open your eyes. Imagine learning that your blood connects you to a throne, and that the man sitting on that throne wanted you dead. That knowledge does something to a person. It does not simply inform, it transforms. In that moment, Cyrus was no longer a shepherd's son with an unusually strong presence. He was a living threat to the most powerful man on the plateau. He was the vine from the dream, and now, for the first time, he knew it. The boy who should not have survived was about to become the man who would make his grandfather's nightmare come true, and the empire that had tried to erase him would be the first to fall. The decision to rebel against the Median Empire was not the kind of decision a rational man would make. The Medes controlled a territory that stretched from the edges of eastern Turkey to the mountains of Afghanistan. They had a professional army, a fortified capital at Ecbatana, and a network of vassal states that owed them tribute, soldiers, and loyalty. Cyrus had none of these things. What he had was a loose confederation of Persian tribes in the southern highlands, proud people, tough people, but people who had spent generations bowing to Median authority. They were subjects. They were not an empire. And yet, sometime around 553 BCE, Cyrus looked at the most powerful kingdom on the Iranian plateau and decided it was time to take it apart. The question that historians have asked for 2,500 years is not whether he succeeded, everyone knows he did. The question is how. How does a vassal chieftain with fewer soldiers, fewer weapons, and no siege equipment defeat an empire that should have crushed him in a single season? The answer is not simple, and it does not begin on a battlefield. It begins with an idea. Before Cyrus could fight the Medes, he had to do something that might have been even harder. He had to unite his own people. The Persian tribes were not a unified nation. They were clans and families spread across the region of Persia, each with their own leaders, their own rivalries, and their own reasons for suspicion. Getting them to follow one man into a suicidal war against their overlords required more than military promises. It required trust. And trust, in the ancient world, was the rarest currency of all. The details of how Cyrus achieved this unity are not fully preserved in the historical record, but the result speaks for itself. By the time he marched north to challenge the Medes, he had something that resembled not just an army but a movement, a body of people who were not fighting simply because they were ordered to, but because they believed in the man leading them and in the future, he described. This distinction matters enormously, because it explains everything that came next. The war between Cyrus and his grandfather Astyages lasted approximately 3 years, from 553 to 550 BCE. In purely military terms, it should have been a short war, and it should have ended with Cyrus's head on a stake outside Ecbatana. The Median army was larger, better equipped, and fighting on home territory. But armies are made of people, and people are not machines. They carry grievances, they remember insults, they calculate their futures, and Astyages, for all his power, had made the kind of mistakes that rulers make when they have held power too long and confused obedience with loyalty. He had alienated members of his own court. He had treated vassal peoples with contempt rather than respect. And crucially, he had created an atmosphere of fear at the center of his kingdom, the same fear that had driven him to order the murder of his own grandson years earlier. Fear is an effective tool of control, but it has a fatal weakness. The moment a credible alternative appears, fear does not inspire people to fight harder. It inspires them to switch sides. And that is exactly what happened. The turning point of the war was not a brilliant tactical maneuver or a decisive battle in the traditional sense. It was a mass defection. Median soldiers, and more importantly Median commanders, began abandoning Astyages and joining Cyrus. Among them, according to Herodotus, was Harpagus himself, the very man who had been ordered to kill Cyrus as an infant and had secretly spared him. Harpagus had nursed his own grievance against the king for years, because Astyages, upon discovering the deception, had punished Harpagus in one of the most horrifying ways recorded in ancient literature. He had Harpagus's own son, killed, cooked, and served to him at a banquet. Whether this gruesome detail is literal history or dramatic embellishment by Herodotus, the underlying point is the same. Astyages ruled through cruelty, and cruelty eventually creates enemies in the very places a king can least afford them, inside his own walls. What Cyrus offered was something the ancient Near East had almost never seen. He did not promise to replace one tyrant with another. He did not march under a banner of revenge or destruction. He presented himself as a liberator, a ruler who would respect the dignity of the people he conquered, who would not burn their temples or erase their traditions, who would govern through partnership rather than terror. This was revolutionary. For centuries, the dominant model of empire in this part of the world had been Assyrian, and the Assyrian model was built on calculated horror, mass deportations of entire populations, public executions designed to traumatize, the deliberate destruction of cultural identity so that conquered peoples had nothing left to rally around. The Medes had inherited some of this brutality, and while they were not as extreme as the Assyrians, they governed through domination, not consent. Cyrus represented a break from that entire tradition, and people responded, not just Persians, but Medes themselves, and eventually peoples across the plateau who saw in Cyrus something they had never been offered before: a choice. The fall of Ecbatana, the Median capital, came around 550 BCE. Astyages, betrayed by his own army, was captured. And here, Cyrus made another decision that separated him from every conqueror who had come before. He did not execute his grandfather. He did not parade him through the streets in chains. By most accounts, Cyrus treated Astyages with a respect that shocked the ancient world, allowing him to live, possibly even keeping him at court. This was not weakness. This was strategy operating on a level that most rulers of the age could not comprehend. By showing mercy to a defeated king, Cyrus sent a message to every other kingdom watching from the edges of the map: surrender to me, and you will not be destroyed. Your gods will be safe. Your people will be safe. Your dignity will survive. It was the most dangerous promise an empire could make, because it meant he actually had to keep it. And standing now in the throne room at Ecbatana, a room built by the dynasty that had tried to murder him in his cradle, Cyrus had proven something that would echo through the centuries. He had proven that an empire could be born not from fear, but from belief, and that the most powerful weapon in the world was not a sword, but an idea that people were willing to follow into the unknown. Babylon in the 6th century, before the Common Era, was not just a city. It was the city, the center of the known world, the place where civilization itself seemed to reach its highest point and then stop, as if even ambition could go no further. Its outer walls stretched for miles, thick enough that 2 chariots could ride side by side along their top. Its inner walls were even more massive, reinforced with towers at regular intervals, surrounded by a moat fed by the Euphrates River that made any direct assault a nightmare of logistics and death. Inside those walls stood temples that had been rebuilt and expanded over 1,000 years, ziggurats that rose above the flat Mesopotamian plain-like man-made mountains, and the legendary hanging gardens, terraces of green cascading down stone terraces in a land where rain was rare, and everything beyond the river's reach turned to dust. Babylon had been besieged before. It had been fought over, damaged, and rebuilt, but it had never truly fallen to an outside force through direct assault. The city was, by every measure the ancient world understood, unconquerable. And that is what makes the night of its fall in October of 539 BCE one of the most astonishing events in all of human history, because when the end came, it came not with the crash of battering rams and the screams of soldiers scaling walls. It came quietly, almost silently, like water finding a crack in stone. To understand how Babylon fell, you first have to understand how Babylon failed itself from the inside. The king of Babylon at this time was Nabonidus, and Nabonidus was a man who seemed determined to lose his own empire. He was not a fool, he was, by many accounts, an intellectual, a man fascinated by ancient history and archaeology, devoted to the moon god Sin in a kingdom whose spiritual heart belonged to Marduk, the chief god of Babylon. This might sound like a small detail, a king who preferred one god over another, but in the ancient world, it was a catastrophe. The priests of Marduk were not just religious figures. They were political power brokers, keepers of tradition, and the spiritual legitimizers of the throne itself. A Babylonian king who neglected Marduk was not just being unorthodox, he was cutting the rope that held his own authority in place. Nabonidus did worse than neglect. He left Babylon entirely for years, relocating to the oasis of Tamar in the Arabian desert for reasons that historians still debate: personal devotion, strategic positioning, or perhaps simply a desire to escape the suffocating politics of his own court. He left his son, Belshazzar, in charge. And Belshazzar, whatever his abilities, was not the king. He was a placeholder in a city that was slowly losing faith in its own leadership. Cyrus saw all of this, and he understood something that purely military commanders often miss, that the strongest walls in the world are worthless if the people behind them no longer believe in the man who commands their defense. Before Cyrus ever moved his army toward Babylon, he launched a campaign that no one in the ancient world had ever seen executed at this scale. It was not a military campaign. It was a campaign of words, of promises, of carefully constructed narrative. Messages spread through Babylonia, carried by merchants, whispered by travelers, circulated among priests that Cyrus was not coming as a destroyer. He was coming as a restorer. He was the chosen instrument of Marduk himself, sent to punish the king who had abandoned the great god and to return Babylon to its rightful glory. This was propaganda of the highest order, and it was devastating precisely because it contained enough truth to be believable. Nabonidus had abandoned Marduk. The temples had been neglected. The festivals had gone uncelebrated. Cyrus was offering the people of Babylon exactly what they wanted to hear, that the outsider was actually the savior, and the king on their own throne was the real enemy. The night Babylon fell has been reconstructed from multiple sources. Herodotus, the Babylonian chronicle known as the Nabonidus Chronicle, and later traditions preserved in the Hebrew Bible. The details vary, but the core of the story is consistent and staggering. Cyrus's engineers diverted the flow of the Euphrates River upstream from the city, reducing the water level where it passed under Babylon's walls to a depth that soldiers could wade through. The riverbed, which was supposed to be an impassable barrier, became a road. Persian forces entered the city through the river gates that, according to Herodotus, had been left open. Whether this was negligence, sabotage from within, or a deliberate act by Babylonians who had already decided to welcome the Persians, the result was the same. Soldiers moved through the city with almost no resistance, and inside the palace, according to the most dramatic versions of the story, Belshazzar was hosting a feast. A great banquet, with wine and music and the golden vessels that Nebuchadnezzar had looted from the temple in Jerusalem decades earlier being used as drinking cups, a final act of arrogance from a regime that did not realize it was already dead. The Book of Daniel in the Hebrew Bible preserves the most famous image from this night mysterious writing, appearing on the wall of the banquet hall, words that none of Belshazzar's wise men could read, a divine message that his kingdom had been weighed, measured, and found wanting. Whether or not one believes in the supernatural element, the symbolic power is undeniable. Babylon did not fall because its walls were breached. It fell because its soul had already surrendered. What Cyrus did after taking Babylon is what separates him from virtually every other conqueror in ancient history. There was no massacre, there was no looting, there was no mass enslavement of the population. Instead, Cyrus entered the city and performed the rituals of Marduk, honoring the god that Nabonidus had neglected, restoring the temples, and presenting himself not as a foreign conqueror, but as the legitimate ruler that Babylon deserved. He issued a decree, inscribed on a clay cylinder that would survive for over 2,000 years, now known as the Cyrus cylinder. On it, Cyrus declared that he had been chosen by Marduk to bring peace, that he had freed peoples who had been held captive, that he had restored sanctuaries and returned sacred images to their rightful temples across Mesopotamia. Among those freed were the Jewish exiles who had been brought to Babylon by Nebuchadnezzar after the destruction of Jerusalem in 586 BCE. Cyrus allowed them to return home. He allowed them to rebuild their temple. This act echoes through the Hebrew Bible, where Cyrus is called a Messiah, an anointed one, the only non-Jewish figure in Scripture to receive that title. For a people who had spent nearly 50 years in captivity, mourning by the rivers of Babylon, the decree of a Persian king was nothing less than salvation. The Cyrus cylinder has been called the first declaration of human rights, and while modern scholars debate whether that label is accurate, it was, after all, a piece of royal propaganda as much as a statement of principle. The debate itself reveals something important. Even if Cyrus's motives were partly strategic, the strategy itself was unlike anything the world had seen. He understood that an empire built on terror requires constant violence to maintain, because the moment the army weakens, the conquered rise. But an empire built on tolerance, on the return of gods and the respect of customs, creates something far more durable, it creates willing subjects, people who are not waiting for the chance to rebel, but who genuinely prefer the new order to the old one. Was it compassion? Was it calculation? The truth is probably both, woven together so tightly that even Cyrus himself might not have known where one ended and the other began. What matters is the result. In a single night, without a battle worthy of the name, the greatest city on earth changed hands. And the man who took it did not destroy it, he honored it, restored it, and made it part of something larger. The Persian Empire now stretched from the mountains of Iran to the rivers of Mesopotamia, and it was only the beginning. Because Cyrus was not finished. He would push east, he would push north, and he would die on a distant frontier still reaching for more. But on this night, in this city, he had done something that would outlast every battle he ever fought. He had shown the world that conquest did not have to mean destruction, and that the most powerful thing a king could do after winning was to show mercy. Cyrus the Great died around 530 BCE, fighting on the northeastern frontier of his empire against the Massagetae, a fierce nomadic people of the Central Asian steppe. The details of his death vary depending on the source. Herodotus tells a brutal story involving the warrior queen Thamyris, who reportedly had Cyrus's severed head dipped into a vessel of blood, telling the dead king to drink his fill of the thing he had always thirsted for. Whether that story is true or embellished, the fact remains that the man who built the Persian Empire did not die peacefully in a palace. He died at the edge of his own ambition, still reaching, still pushing the borders outward. His body was brought back to Pasargadae, his capital, and placed in a modest stone tomb that still stands today, simple, quiet, and completely at odds with the enormity of what he had created. But empires do not pause to mourn. The machine Cyrus had set in motion was too large, too fast, and too hungry to stop for the death of one man, even its founder. What came next would determine whether the Persian Empire was a flash of brilliance that died with its creator or something far more permanent. The answer came in the form of Darius I, who took the throne around 522 BCE after a period of chaos, rebellion, and contested succession that nearly ripped the empire apart before it had fully taken shape. Darius was not a direct heir of Cyrus. His claim to the throne was disputed even in his own time, and he secured power through a combination of political maneuvering, military force, and what some historians suspect was a carefully constructed lie about a false pretender named Bardia. The details are murky and deliberately, so Darius himself controlled the narrative, literally carving his version of events into a cliff face at Behistun, high above a road in western Iran, in 3 languages, so that every traveller passing below would absorb his truth. But whatever the morality of how he took power, what Darius did with it was nothing short of extraordinary. He looked at the vast, unwieldy collection of conquered peoples and territories that Cyrus had assembled from Egypt in the west to the edges of India in the east, from the freezing plains north of the Caspian Sea to the deserts of Arabia, and he asked a question that no conqueror before him had ever seriously tried to answer. Not how do I keep conquering, but how do I make this hold together? The system Darius created was the satrap system, and it was a masterpiece of political engineering. He divided the empire into approximately 20 provinces, each called a satrapy, each governed by a satrap, a word that roughly translates to protector of the realm. These satraps were powerful figures, often drawn from the Persian nobility or from loyal local elites, and they had real authority within their provinces. They collected taxes, administered justice, raised local troops, and maintained order. But Darius was not naive enough to hand out power without checks. Alongside each satrap, he placed a military commander who reported directly to the king, not to the governor, creating a built-in tension that prevented any single official from accumulating enough power to rebel. He also deployed a network of royal inspectors, known informally as the eyes and ears of the king, who travelled the empire unannounced, reporting back to the central court on the behaviour and loyalty of every official. It was a system of trust, layered with surveillance, autonomy balanced by accountability, and it worked across a territory that covered roughly 2 million square miles and contained an estimated 50 million people, speaking dozens of languages and worshipping hundreds of gods. The infrastructure Darius built to support this system was equally staggering. The Royal Road, the most famous achievement of Persian engineering, stretched roughly 1,600 miles from the capital at Susa in southwestern Iran to the city of Sardis in western Turkey, near the Aegean coast. It was not merely a road, it was a communications network. Relay stations were placed at regular intervals along its length, each one staffed with fresh horses and riders, so that a royal message could travel the entire distance in approximately 7 days. Herodotus, who was not easily impressed, wrote that nothing mortal travelled faster than these Persian couriers, and he noted that neither snow nor rain nor heat nor darkness stopped them from completing their appointed rounds, a description so vivid that it was later adopted, almost word for word, as the unofficial motto of the United States Postal Service more than 2,000 years later. Beyond the royal road, Darius standardized the currency of the empire with the gold daric, creating an economic common language that allowed trade to flow across vast distances. He standardized weights and measures. He invested in canal projects, including a predecessor to the Suez Canal connecting the Nile to the Red Sea. He was not just a king, he was an architect, building not a monument but a machine. But the most remarkable feature of the Persian system was not its roads or its coins or its inspectors. It was its philosophy. The Persian Empire, under both Cyrus and Darius, operated on a principle that was almost unheard of in the ancient world, the principle that conquered peoples did not need to be culturally destroyed in order to be politically controlled. Local religions were not just tolerated but actively supported. Local languages continued to be used in administration alongside Aramaic, which served as a common tongue. Local customs, laws, and traditions were left intact as long as taxes were paid and loyalty was maintained. This was not charity. It was strategy of the deepest kind. Darius understood that a man who is allowed to keep his gods, speak his language, and live by his own customs has very little reason to risk his life in a rebellion. An empire that respects its subjects can govern them with a fraction of the military force required by an empire that terrorizes them. This insight, so obvious in hindsight, so rarely practiced in history, was the true engine of Persian power. Nowhere was this philosophy made more visible than at Persepolis, the ceremonial capital that Darius began building around 515 BCE in the heartland of Persia. Persepolis was not designed to be the administrative center of the empire. That role belonged to Susa and, to a lesser extent, Babylon and Ecbatana. Persepolis was something else entirely. It was a stage, a theater of empire. Every spring, during the festival of Nowruz, delegations from every corner of the empire traveled to Persepolis to present tribute to the king. And the stone reliefs that lined the grand staircases, many of which still survive today, depicted these delegations in extraordinary detail. Lydians bringing gold bracelets, Babylonians leading bulls, Ethiopians carrying ivory, Indians offering gold dust, Armenians presenting horses. Each delegation was shown in its own clothing, with its own hairstyles, its own cultural markers, and critically, none of them were shown in chains. They were shown walking willingly, proudly, as participants in a shared enterprise. This was propaganda, without question. But it was propaganda that reflected a real policy, and that policy was this: you do not have to stop being who you are to be part of this empire. You just have to be part of it. The contrast with every empire that preceded Persia is devastating when you see it clearly. Assyria had ruled through terror and erasure. Babylon had ruled through deportation and cultural replacement. Egypt had ruled through divine isolation, treating all outsiders as lesser by nature. Persia looked at the same map and made a fundamentally different choice. It chose to let the world be diverse and still be one. It was not perfect. It was not always practiced as cleanly as the reliefs at Persepolis suggested. There were revolts, and those revolts were crushed with force. There were satraps who abused their power. There were kings after Darius who fell short of the ideal. But the ideal itself, the idea that a vast, multicultural empire could be held together not by chains but by a shared system of governance and mutual respect, was something the world had never seen at this scale. And here is the question that should trouble anyone who cares about history. If this system was so effective, so advanced, so far ahead of its time that echoes of it can be found in the Roman provincial system, in the Ottoman millet system, in the very concept of federalism that shapes modern nations, then why is it not taught in every school on earth? Why do most people know the name of every Roman emperor but cannot name a single Persian king after Cyrus? The answer to that question is coming, and it begins with a war that the West has been telling from only one side for 2,500 years. There is no story in Western history more famous than this one. 300 Spartan warriors, led by their king Leonidas, standing in a narrow mountain pass called Thermopylae, holding back an ocean of Persian soldiers for 3 days, while the rest of Greece had time to prepare its defense. It is a story about courage, sacrifice, and the triumph of free men against a slave empire. It has been told in books, carved into monuments, painted on walls, and turned into Hollywood blockbusters. It is, without question, one of the most powerful stories ever told about what it means to fight for freedom. It is also, in critical ways, a lie. Not a complete lie. The bravery at Thermopylae was real, and no honest account of history should take that away from the men who died there. But the story, as most people know, it has been shaped, inflated, and distorted so thoroughly over 2,500 years that it has become something more dangerous than a simple exaggeration. It has become a founding myth, the story the West tells itself about where civilization began and who the enemies of civilization have always been. And like most founding myths, it only works if you never hear the other side. Let us start with the numbers, because the numbers are where the distortion begins. Herodotus, the Greek historian who is our primary source for the Greco-Persian Wars, claimed that Xerxes invaded Greece with an army of over 2 million soldiers, supported by a fleet of over 1,000 ships. These numbers have been repeated for centuries, as if they were fact. They are not. Modern historians, using analysis of logistics, supply lines, the carrying capacity of ancient roads, and the available manpower of the Persian Empire, estimate that Xerxes' invasion force was somewhere between 70,000 and 120,000 soldiers, still an enormous army by ancient standards, still far larger than anything the Greek city-states could assemble individually, but not the apocalyptic human flood that Herodotus described. The inflation of Persian numbers served a clear purpose. The larger the enemy, the greater the Greek achievement in resisting them. If 300 Spartans held off 100,000 Persians, that is heroic. If they held off 2 million, that is divine. The exaggeration was not accidental. It was the foundation of a narrative designed to make Greek victory seem not just impressive but miraculous. Ordained by the gods, proof that Greek civilization was inherently superior to the vast, faceless horde from the east. Now let us ask the question that this narrative conveniently avoids. Why did Xerxes invade Greece in the first place? The standard Western telling frames the invasion as an act of unprovoked imperial aggression, a tyrannical empire trying to crush the freedom-loving Greeks simply because they existed. The reality is more complicated and far less flattering to Athens. In 499 BCE, the Greek cities of Ionia, located on the western coast of modern Turkey, within the Persian Empire, revolted against Persian rule. This revolt was supported and partly funded by Athens, which sent ships and soldiers to help the Ionian Greeks. During this conflict, the rebels burned the Persian city of Sardis, the capital of the western satrapies and one of the most important administrative centers in the empire. The burning of Sardis was, from the Persian perspective, an act of war committed by a foreign state against Persian territory. When Darius I launched the first Persian expedition against Greece in 490 BCE, the campaign that ended at the Battle of Marathon, he was not randomly attacking a faraway land. He was responding to a direct assault on his empire. Xerxes, his son and successor, continued this policy. The invasion of 480 BCE was not born from a desire to enslave Greece. It was born from a strategic calculation that the Greek city-states, particularly Athens, were a persistent threat to Persian stability in the Aegean region and needed to be brought under control or neutralized. And here is another part of the story that rarely gets told. The Persians did not arrive in Greece demanding the total submission and enslavement of every Greek city. Their standard practice, the same practice that had governed their empire for decades, was to offer terms. Cities that submitted to Persian authority were allowed to keep their local governments, their temples, their customs, and their laws. They were required to acknowledge Persian sovereignty, provide tribute that was generally proportional to their wealth, and supply soldiers when called upon. That was the deal. And it is a deal that many Greek cities accepted. The common image of a unified Greece standing shoulder to shoulder against the Persian invader is another distortion. In reality, Greek unity was fragile, partial, and contested. Many northern Greek states submitted to Xerxes willingly. Thebes, one of the most powerful cities in Greece, fought on the Persian side at the Battle of Plataea. The Greek alliance was dominated by Sparta and Athens, and even between those two cities, there was deep mistrust and disagreement about strategy. The idea that all of Greece rose as one to defend freedom is a story that Athens and Sparta told after they won, and they told it loudly enough that it became the only version most people ever heard. The battle at Thermopylae itself was a real event with real heroism. Leonidas and his 300 Spartans, along with several thousand other Greek soldiers who are almost never mentioned in the popular telling, held the narrow coastal pass for approximately 3 days against a much larger Persian force. The terrain was the great equalizer, preventing Xerxes from using his numerical advantage. When a local Greek traitor named Ephialtes showed the Persians a mountain path that allowed them to outflank the defenders, Leonidas made the decision to stay and fight a rearguard action, knowing it meant death. He and his Spartans were killed. It was a genuine act of sacrifice, and it deserves respect. But it was not the turning point of the war. The Battle of Salamis, fought at sea weeks later, was the true decisive moment, and even that victory did not end the conflict cleanly. Xerxes withdrew the bulk of his forces back to Asia after Salamis, but he left a substantial army in Greece under his general Mardonius. It took another year, and the bloody Battle of Plataea in 479 BCE to drive the remaining Persian forces out. The Persian withdrawal was not a panicked collapse. It was the retreat of an overstretched campaign that had achieved some of its objectives, punishing Athens, which had been captured and burned but failed in its larger goal of bringing Greece into the empire. What happened after the war is where the real damage was done, not on the battlefield, but in the telling. Athens, riding the wave of victory, entered its golden age. It built the Parthenon. It produced Herodotus, Thucydides, Sophocles, Plato, and Aristotle. It created a cultural legacy so towering that it would define Western civilization for millennia. And in that legacy, the story of the Persian Wars became the origin story, the moment when freedom defeated tyranny, when West defeated East, when civilization defeated barbarism. Persia was cast as the villain in this story, and not just any villain, but the permanent archetype of Eastern despotism, faceless, tyrannical, decadent, and fundamentally opposed to everything the West claimed to value. This narrative was not just a Greek invention. It was inherited by Rome, revived during the Enlightenment, reinforced during the colonial era when European powers needed intellectual justification for their domination of Asia and Africa, and amplified again in the modern era through films, books, and political rhetoric that frames the Middle East as the eternal adversary of Western freedom. The empire that had invented religious tolerance, multicultural governance, and the first declaration of human rights was reduced to a one-dimensional enemy in someone else's story. Greek courage at Thermopylae was real, but the myth built on top of that courage, the myth that said the East was darkness and the West was light, was one of the most successful and most damaging pieces of propaganda in human history. And the Persian Empire, which had no surviving voice to tell its own story, paid the price for that silence for the next 25 centuries. The war was over. But the real battle, the battle over memory, over who gets to define what civilization means, was just beginning. And it was a battle Persia had already lost. The Persian Empire did not die the way most people imagine empires die, in a single catastrophic moment, overwhelmed by some unstoppable foreign force. It died the way old trees die, slowly, from the inside, while still looking strong from the outside. The bark holds, the branches still spread wide, but deep in the heartwood, something has gone soft. Something has been eaten away by forces so quiet and so patient that by the time anyone notices, it is already too late. The century and a half between the reign of Xerxes and the arrival of Alexander the Great is the part of Persian history that almost nobody tells, because it lacks the drama of conquest and the spectacle of sudden destruction. But it is, in many ways, the most important part of the story, because it explains how the largest and most advanced empire the world had ever known became vulnerable enough for a 25-year-old Macedonian king to tear it apart in less than 5 years. The trouble began almost immediately after Xerxes. In 465 BCE, Xerxes was murdered not by a foreign assassin, not on a battlefield, but in his own bedroom, killed by the captain of his royal guard, a man named Artabanus, who had been one of the most trusted figures at court. The assassination was part of a palace conspiracy, the kind of power grab that happens when the inner circle of an empire starts to believe that the throne is a prize to be seized rather than a trust to be honored. Xerxes' son, Artaxerxes I, eventually took the throne after a brutal struggle that left members of his own family dead. And this pattern, murder, conspiracy, succession by blood and betrayal, would repeat itself again and again over the next 130 years, each cycle weakening the center a little more, each transition leaving scars that never fully healed. The court that Cyrus had built as a place of vision and governance became something else entirely. It became a place of whispers. The royal harem, where the wives, mothers, and concubines of the king wielded enormous behind-the-scenes influence, became a theater of poison and manipulation. Queen mothers plotted to place their favored sons on the throne. Eunuchs who controlled access to the king became kingmakers. Trusted advisors learned that loyalty was less valuable than leverage, and that the safest position in the empire was not beside the king but behind him, in the shadows where real decisions were made. While the court consumed itself, the edges of the empire began to pull away. Egypt, which had been conquered by Cambyses, the son of Cyrus, revolted successfully around 404 BCE and remained independent for over 60 years. This was not a minor border skirmish. Egypt was one of the wealthiest and most strategically important provinces in the empire, and its loss was a humiliation that multiple Persian kings tried and failed to reverse. In western Anatolia, the satraps, those powerful provincial governors who had been the backbone of Darius's administrative genius, began to act less like loyal officials and more like independent rulers. The Great Satraps' Revolt of the 360s BCE saw multiple governors across the western provinces rise in coordinated rebellion against the central throne. The revolt was eventually suppressed, but the fact that it happened at all revealed a devastating truth. The system of trust and balanced autonomy that had held the empire together was breaking down. Satraps who had once been checked by royal inspectors and competing military commanders now had enough local power, wealth, and military force to challenge the king himself. The very flexibility that had made the empire resilient was now being exploited by ambitious men who saw weakness at the center and opportunity at the edges. And then there was the deepest irony of all the Greeks. The same people Persia had fought at Marathon, Thermopylae, and Salamis became, in the decades that followed, one of the empire's most relied upon military resources. Greek mercenaries, hardened professional soldiers willing to fight for anyone who could pay, became a fixture of Persian armies and Persian internal conflicts. When Cyrus the Younger, a Persian prince, not to be confused with Cyrus the Great, attempted to overthrow his brother King Artaxerxes II in 401 BCE, the core of his strike force was a contingent of 10,000 Greek mercenaries. The expedition failed. Cyrus the Younger was killed at the Battle of Cunaxa, and the 10,000 Greeks had to fight their way back home through hostile Persian territory in one of the most famous military retreats in ancient history, later immortalized by the soldier-writer Xenophon. But the episode revealed something that should have terrified every strategic mind in Persia. A relatively small force of well-trained Greek heavy infantry had marched deep into the heart of the empire, fought a pitched battle within sight of Babylon, and then marched out again, bruised but unbroken. The empire's military, once the most feared force on earth, was no longer enough on its own. It needed foreign soldiers to fill its ranks, and those foreign soldiers were learning, with every campaign, exactly how vulnerable the empire had become. By the time Darius III took the throne around 336 BCE, the Persian Empire was still enormous on a map. It still collected tribute from dozens of peoples. Its palaces were still filled with gold and the accumulated luxury of 2 centuries of dominance. But the substance behind the surface had been hollowed out. The succession had been violent and contested. The satraps were unreliable. The military was dependent on mercenaries whose loyalty was to their paychecks, not to the throne. The court was a nest of competing factions more interested in internal advantage than external threats. And the people of the empire, those 50 million subjects who had once been held together by a system of tolerance and mutual benefit, had no particular reason to fight and die for a king they did not know, installed by a process they did not trust, ruling from a palace consumed by its own intrigues. The empire was still standing, but it was standing the way a hollowed-out tree stands upright, impressive from a distance, and waiting for the one strong wind that would bring it all crashing down. That wind was already gathering force, far to the west, in a small kingdom called Macedonia, and it had a name that the world would never forget. He crossed the Hellespont in the spring of 334 BCE with roughly 37,000 soldiers, a force that would not have been enough to garrison a single large Persian province. He was 25 years old. He had been king of Macedonia for barely 2 years, having taken the throne after the assassination of his father Philip II, under circumstances that some ancient sources hint Alexander himself may not have been entirely innocent of. He had no navy to speak of. He had limited funds, in fact. His war chest was nearly empty before the campaign even began, and he had borrowed heavily to equip his army. By every rational calculation of military strength, logistics, and strategic reality, he should have been crushed within the first months of his invasion, his army swallowed by the sheer vastness of the empire he was attacking. But Alexander of Macedon did not operate by rational calculation. He operated by a conviction so deep and so total that it bent the world around him, the conviction that he was not merely a king, but something more, something chosen, something divine. His mother Olympias had told him since childhood that his true father was not Philip, but Zeus himself. Alexander believed it, and that belief, whether it was madness or genius or both fused into something the ancient world had never encountered, made him the most dangerous man alive. The first clash came at the Granicus River in western Anatolia, where a force of local Persian satraps and their Greek mercenaries attempted to stop Alexander before he could push deeper into the empire. The battle was fierce and nearly killed Alexander in its opening moments. A Persian noble reportedly struck his helmet with a sword and was about to deliver a killing blow before one of Alexander's companions cut the attacker down. But the Persians at the Granicus made a critical error. They fought a defensive battle at a river crossing, relying on cavalry and position rather than bringing the full weight of the empire's resources to bear. Alexander broke through, the Persian line collapsed, and the western provinces of the empire began to fall like a row of stones toppling into each other. City after city opened its gates. Sardis, the old Lydian capital and the seat of Persian power in the west, surrendered without a fight. The speed of the collapse was not just a testament to Alexander's military skill, it was a reflection of how little loyalty the western satraps commanded. The system that Darius the Great had built to hold the empire together through trust and balanced authority had been corroded by generations of court intrigue and neglect. The governors who should have rallied their provinces and fought to the last instead calculated their odds, looked at the rot behind them and the momentum in front of them, and made their choices accordingly. Darius III finally met Alexander in person at the Battle of Issus in November 333 BCE on a narrow coastal plain in southern Turkey. And here is where the Greek-written history commits its greatest injustice against the Persian king. Darius has come down through the centuries as a coward, a man who fled the battlefield at the first sign of danger, who abandoned his army, his family, and his honor in a single act of panic. The reality was far more complicated. At Issus, Darius had actually managed to maneuver his army behind Alexander's forces, cutting off the Macedonian supply line, a strategic achievement that should have been decisive. But the narrow terrain favored Alexander's compact, disciplined phalanx over the larger Persian force, which could not deploy its numerical advantage effectively. When Alexander led a direct cavalry charge toward Darius's position, a tactic of suicidal boldness that no conventional commander would attempt, the Persian center buckled. Darius withdrew. He did not flee blindly, he attempted to regroup, to fight another day with better ground and better odds. But the narrative that survived was written by Greek and Macedonian sources, and in their telling, Darius ran. His mother, his wife, and his children were captured in the Persian camp after the battle. Alexander treated them with elaborate courtesy, a gesture that was both genuinely magnanimous and brilliantly calculated to humiliate Darius, by demonstrating that a foreign conqueror was more honorable toward the Persian royal family than their own king had been in abandoning them. The final reckoning came at Gaugamela on the first day of October, 331 BCE, on a wide, flat plain near modern-day Erbil in northern Iraq. This time, Darius had chosen the ground carefully. The plain was vast and open, perfect for the Persian cavalry and war chariots, eliminating the terrain disadvantage that had crippled him at Issus. He had assembled an army that outnumbered Alexander's forces by at least 2-1. Possibly more estimates range from 50,000 to over 100,000 Persian troops against Alexander's 47,000. He had scythed chariots designed to tear through infantry formations. He had even ordered the ground leveled and smoothed in front of his lines to give the chariots a clear run. By every measure of preparation and numerical strength, this should have been the battle where the Persian Empire reasserted itself and sent the young Macedonian king back across the Aegean in pieces. It was not. Alexander opened the battle with a deliberate feint to the right, drawing the Persian left wing out of position and creating a gap in the center of Darius's line. Then he drove his elite cavalry directly into that gap, angling straight for Darius himself. It was the same tactic he had used at Issus, a targeted strike at the head of the enemy, designed to kill or rout the king and collapse the army's will to fight in a single stroke. And once again, it worked. The Persian center shattered. Darius, seeing his guard overwhelmed and the Macedonian cavalry closing in, turned and fled the battlefield. This time, the flight was truly the end. The army, seeing their king abandon the field, disintegrated. What followed was not just a military defeat, it was the unraveling of a world. Darius fled east, hoping to raise new forces from the empire's remaining provinces. But the loyalty that had once held the system together was gone. His own satraps, the men who owed their positions and their wealth to the Persian throne, began calculating which side would win and adjusting their allegiance accordingly. The satrap Bessus, governor of Bactria and a relative of the royal family, made his calculation coldest of all. He seized Darius, held him prisoner, and when Alexander's pursuit drew close, Bessus had the king stabbed and left on the side of a road in the dust of eastern Iran, dying or already dead. When Alexander found the body, and here the story reaches a moment that transcends military history and enters something deeper, he reportedly covered Darius with his own cloak and wept. Whether those tears were real or performed, whether Alexander mourned the man or merely honored the symbol, the gesture carried an unmistakable meaning. Alexander understood, perhaps better than anyone in his army, that what had just ended was not simply a dynasty or a government, it was a civilization, an idea of empire that had governed tens of millions of people for over 2 centuries, that had connected India to Egypt, that had allowed 100 cultures to coexist under a single system of governance. That idea was now dead, murdered by its own servants on a dusty road, and even the man who had destroyed it recognized the enormity of the loss. Alexander had Bessus hunted down and executed not out of loyalty to Darius, but because a world in which satraps murdered their own kings was a world in which no king was safe. And then Alexander turned south and rode toward the heart of the empire he had just conquered. He was heading for Persepolis. There is a particular kind of destruction that goes beyond the physical. When a house burns, a family loses its shelter. When a city burns, a people lose their home. But when the ceremonial heart of an entire civilization burns the place where its identity was carved into stone, where its history was recorded, where its vision of the world was made visible for all to see, what is lost cannot be measured in buildings or gold. What is lost is memory itself. And on a night in the spring of 330 BCE, in the mountains of southern Iran, the memory of the Persian Empire went up in flames so vast that ancient sources say the glow could be seen for miles across the darkened plain. The fire that consumed Persepolis was not just an act of war. It was, whether intended or not, an act of erasure, and the world has been living with its consequences ever since. Alexander arrived at Persepolis in January of 330 BCE, months after his decisive victory at Gaugamela and the death of Darius III. The city surrendered without resistance. There was no siege, no battle, no last stand by a garrison defending the empire's most sacred site. The gates opened, and the Macedonian army walked in. What they found inside must have staggered even soldiers who had already looted Susa and Babylon. Persepolis was not built to be a functioning capital, it was built to be a statement. The treasury alone contained wealth that modern historians estimate at the equivalent of billions in today's currency: gold, silver, precious objects accumulated over 2 centuries from every corner of an empire that had stretched from North Africa to Central Asia. The palace complex itself was a masterwork of architecture and symbolic design. The Apadana, the great audience hall, could hold thousands. Its staircases were lined with those extraordinary stone reliefs, the delegations of nations, each one carved with such detail that historians can identify the ethnic clothing, hairstyles, and tribute goods of peoples from Ethiopia to India. The Gate of All Nations bore inscriptions in 3 languages welcoming visitors from across the empire. Every surface, every column, every carved figure was a testament to the idea that had defined the Persian Empire from its founding, that diversity was not a weakness to be crushed, but a strength to be displayed. And in the span of a single night, Alexander's soldiers put it all to the torch. The ancient sources disagree on why it happened, and that disagreement has haunted historians for over 2,000 years. The most dramatic account comes from the later historian Diodorus, who tells a story involving a banquet, heavy drinking, and a woman, an Athenian courtesan named Thais, who allegedly suggested that setting fire to Persepolis would be the perfect revenge for Xerxes' burning of Athens 150 years earlier. In this version, Alexander, inflamed by wine and the cheers of his companions, seized a torch and led the destruction himself, with Thais at his side. Other accounts suggest the burning was more deliberate, a calculated political act designed to send an unmistakable signal to every remaining Persian loyalist that the old order was permanently finished, that there was no throne left to restore, no sacred center to rally around. Some modern historians argue it was a combination of both a decision made in the haze of celebration but rooted in a strategic logic that Alexander was too shrewd to have ignored entirely. Whatever the exact chain of events, the result was the same. The great halls burned. The wooden roofs and cedar beams that supported the massive stone columns caught fire and collapsed. The administrative records, tablets, and documents that contained the bureaucratic memory of how the empire had been governed, how its provinces had been organized, how its finances had been managed, were destroyed or scattered. The reliefs survived in part because they were carved in stone, but the complex as a whole was devastated beyond recovery. What was lost at Persepolis extends far beyond what can be catalogued in an archaeological report. When a civilization's administrative records are destroyed, the practical knowledge of how that civilization functioned disappears. We know the Persian Empire had a sophisticated system of governance, but so much of the detail of how it actually worked on a day-to-day basis was lost in fires like this one that historians have been forced to reconstruct Persian history largely from Greek sources. And Greek sources, as we have already seen, had their own agenda. They wrote about Persia as an enemy, as a cautionary tale about despotism and Eastern excess, not as a civilization worthy of study and admiration on its own terms. The burning of Persepolis did not just destroy buildings, it destroyed the Persian Empire's ability to speak for itself across the centuries. It handed the narrative to the victors permanently. There is a direct line between the flames at Persepolis and the fact that most people today can name a dozen Roman emperors but cannot name a single Persian king after Cyrus. The fire did not just end an empire, it ended a voice. The cruelest part of the story is what came after. Almost immediately, according to multiple sources, Alexander regretted what he had done. The man who had wept over the body of Darius, who had shown courtesy to the Persian royal family, who would spend the remaining years of his life adopting Persian customs, wearing Persian clothing, marrying a Persian princess, and trying desperately to fuse Greek and Persian culture into something new. That man looked at the smoking ruins of Persepolis and understood that he had destroyed something he could never rebuild. He had conquered the Persian Empire because he could. He had burned its heart because a moment of triumph and wine and the roar of his soldiers made it feel right. And then the moment passed, and the ashes cooled, and what was left was silence. Alexander would go on to push east, all the way to India, driven by a hunger that nothing could satisfy. He would die in Babylon in 323 BCE, at the age of 32, possibly from fever, possibly from poison, in a palace that had once belonged to the empire he had unmade. His own empire would shatter within years of his death, divided among generals who fought over the pieces like wolves over a carcass. But the fire at Persepolis outlasted all of it. It burned longer than Alexander's empire. It burned longer than the memory of his victories. Because when you destroy a civilization's ability to tell its own story, the silence that follows is not temporary, it is permanent, or as close to permanent as history allows. And into that silence, other voices rush in, telling their own version, shaping the narrative to serve their own purposes, until the truth is buried so deep that most people do not even know there is something buried at all. Alexander died in Babylon in June of 323 BCE, 32 years old, burning with fever in a palace that had once belonged to the kings he had conquered. He left behind no clear heir, no stable succession plan, and an empire so vast and so hastily assembled that it began tearing itself apart before his body was cold. His generals, men who had fought beside him from Macedonia to India, turned on each other almost immediately, carving the conquered world into rival kingdoms in a series of brutal wars that lasted decades. The eastern portions of Alexander's empire, including the old Persian heartland, fell to a general named Seleucus, who founded what became the Seleucid dynasty. Greek became the language of the court. Greek cities were planted across the landscape. Greek gods stood in temples where Ahura Mazda had once been honored, and for a brief moment it looked as though the Persian identity, the language, the customs, the spiritual traditions, the entire way of understanding the world that had been built over centuries might actually be extinguished for good. Crushed, not just politically but culturally, replaced by the civilization of the conquerors, absorbed into a Hellenistic world that had no place for what Persia had been. But that is not what happened. What happened instead is one of the most remarkable acts of civilizational survival in human history, a refusal to disappear that would echo across 2,000 years and reshape the world in ways that most people have never been taught. The first sign that Persia was not dead came from the northeast, from the steppe borderlands where a people called the Pani, an Iranian nomadic group, began pushing into the Seleucid territories around 247 BCE. Under a leader named Arsaces, they established what would become the Parthian Empire, a state that grew steadily over the next century until it controlled nearly all the territory that had once been the Achaemenid heartland. The Parthians were not simply another nomadic conquest. They were a deliberate revival. They adopted Persian administrative practices. They used Aramaic and later Parthian, an Iranian language, in their official documents. They honored Zoroastrian traditions. They positioned themselves not as successors to Alexander's Greek world, but as heirs to something older and deeper, the Persian tradition of empire. And they proved it on the battlefield. In 53 BCE, at the Battle of Carrhae in what is now southeastern Turkey, a Parthian army annihilated a Roman invasion force led by Marcus Crassus, one of the richest and most powerful men in Rome. Crassus was killed. His legions were destroyed. And Rome, the new master of the Mediterranean, learned a lesson that it would never fully overcome, that to the east there was still a power rooted in Persian soil that could not be broken. The Parthians held Rome at bay for nearly 3 centuries, fighting a grinding series of wars along the Euphrates frontier that neither side could decisively win. But the true resurrection of Persian identity came in 224 CE, when a local ruler from the province of Fars, the very heartland of the old Achaemenid dynasty, rose up against the last Parthian king and established a new empire. His name was Ardashir, and the dynasty he founded was called the Sassanids. The Sassanids did not merely echo the old Persian Empire, they consciously and explicitly claimed to be its continuation. They traced their lineage to the Achaemenids. They revived Zoroastrianism as the official state religion with an organized priesthood and a codified scripture. They rebuilt the institutions of centralized Persian governance. They created art, architecture, and court rituals that deliberately recalled the grandeur of Persepolis. And for over 400 years, from 224 to 651 CE, the Sassanid Empire stood as one of the 2 great powers of the ancient and late antique world, facing the Roman and later Byzantine Empire across a frontier that ran through Mesopotamia and the mountains of Armenia. The Sassanids traded with China, influenced the art of India, and created a culture so rich and so deeply rooted that when the empire finally fell, its legacy did not fall with it. The Arab conquest of the Sassanid Empire in the mid-7th century CE brought Islam to the Iranian plateau and ended the last Persian dynasty of antiquity. But the conquerors found that they could not simply replace what Persia had built, they had to absorb it. Persian administrators ran the new Islamic caliphates because nobody else had the expertise to govern territories that large. Persian became the language of poetry, philosophy, and high culture across the Islamic world, from Baghdad to Delhi. The Islamic Golden Age, that extraordinary flowering of science, medicine, mathematics, literature, and philosophy between the 8th and 14th centuries was built on foundations that were deeply and unmistakably Persian. The great scholars who translated Greek philosophy into Arabic and expanded upon it worked in a Persian intellectual tradition. The gardens that defined Islamic palace architecture were Persian gardens. The bureaucratic systems that held the Abbasid Caliphate together were modelled on Sassanid administration. When the Mughal emperors built their courts in India, they modelled them on Persian culture. When the Ottoman Empire organised its government, Persian influence was woven into its structure. Persia did not survive as a museum relic or a nostalgic memory. It survived as a living force, shaping civilizations that did not always acknowledge where their ideas came from. Today, the ruins of Persepolis stand in the Iranian desert, a UNESCO World Heritage Site visited by tourists from around the world. The stone columns still rise against the sky, the carved reliefs, those extraordinary images of nations walking together, bearing gifts, dressed in their own clothing, and honoring their own identities still line the staircases. But most visitors walk through these ruins without understanding what they are looking at. They see old stones, they see an ancient site. They do not see what was taken from the world when these halls burned. They do not see the system of governance that preceded Rome by centuries, the declaration of human rights that preceded the Enlightenment by 2,000 years, the vision of multicultural empire that the modern world still struggles to achieve. They do not see the ghost. But the ghost is there in the stones, in the silence, in the wind that moves across the platform the same way it has for 2,500 years. And it is waiting, as it has always been waiting, for someone to finally tell its story. That story is not finished, because the forces that erased it are still at work in textbooks, in political narratives, in the assumptions that shape how the world understands its own past. And it is those forces that we must now confront directly. There is a kind of violence that does not require a single weapon. It does not need armies or fire or the sacking of cities. It is quieter than all of those things, and in the long run, it is more effective than any of them. It is the violence of forgetting the slow, deliberate, sometimes unconscious act of erasing a civilization from the story that the world tells about itself. And if you grew up anywhere in the Western world, if you attended school in Europe, America, Australia, or anywhere shaped by the Western educational tradition, then this violence was done in front of you, with your participation, and you almost certainly did not notice. Because the story you were told about where civilization came from, the story of Greece and Rome as the twin fountains of democracy, philosophy, law, and human progress, is not the whole story. It is a carefully edited version. And what was edited out, more thoroughly and more deliberately than almost anything else in the history of ideas, was Persia. The editing began with the Greeks themselves. Herodotus, the man often called the father of history, wrote his histories in the 5th century BCE, and the Greco-Persian Wars were at the center of his work. Herodotus was not a simple propagandist. He was, in many ways, remarkably fair-minded for his time, and he included details about Persian culture and customs that showed genuine curiosity and even admiration. But the framework of his narrative was clear. Greece represented freedom. Persia represented tyranny. The wars between them were not just military conflicts, they were a cosmic struggle between two ways of life, and the Greek way was presented as inherently superior. This framework was not invented by Herodotus alone. It reflected the self-understanding of Athenian culture at its peak, a culture that needed a defining enemy to justify its own identity. And Persia, vast and powerful and conveniently different, was the perfect candidate. Later, Greek writers hardened this framework into something more rigid and more damaging. By the time of Aristotle, the idea that Eastern peoples were naturally suited to despotism, while Western peoples were naturally suited to freedom, had become an intellectual assumption so deeply embedded that it no longer needed to be argued. It was simply accepted as the way things were. This assumption would survive for over 2,000 years. When the Roman Empire fell and Europe entered the medieval period, the Greek texts were preserved in part, ironically, by Persian and Arab scholars who translated them into Arabic and kept them alive while Europe forgot its own intellectual heritage. When those texts were rediscovered during the Renaissance and the Enlightenment, European thinkers seized upon them with an almost religious fervor. Greece became the sacred origin point of Western civilization. The Enlightenment philosophers Montesquieu, Voltaire, Hegel built entire theories of history around the division between a free, rational West and a despotic, stagnant East. Montesquieu's theory of Oriental despotism, which argued that Eastern civilizations were inherently prone to tyranny because of their climate and geography, became one of the most influential ideas in modern political thought. It shaped how Europeans understood Asia, Africa, and the Middle East. It provided intellectual cover for colonialism after all. If Eastern peoples were naturally incapable of self-governance, then European domination was not exploitation but a civilizing mission. And at the foundation of all of this, barely visible but structurally essential, was the original Greek narrative about Persia, the story that said the East was darkness and the West was light. The specific achievements that were erased or attributed to others are staggering when you list them plainly. The concept of a postal system relay stations with fresh horses carrying messages across vast distances was a Persian invention under Darius the Great, centuries before any European system existed. The Qanat, an underground irrigation channel that could carry water across miles of arid land without evaporation, was a Persian engineering achievement that made agriculture possible in regions that would otherwise have been desert, and variations of this technology are still in use today, across the Middle East and North Africa. The word paradise itself comes from the old Persian word paradisa, meaning an enclosed garden. The Persians invented the formal garden as a concept, and it traveled through Islamic culture into European tradition, shaping everything from Moorish Spain to the gardens of Versailles. Persian contributions to mathematics, astronomy, and medicine were absorbed into the Islamic Golden Age and transmitted to Europe, where they were frequently credited to Arab or Greek sources without acknowledgement of their Persian origins. The very system of provincial governance that Rome used to administer its empire bore striking resemblances to the Persian satrap system that preceded it by centuries. But in Western textbooks, Roman administration is treated as an original innovation, while Persian administration is barely mentioned at all. This is not about anger. It is not about assigning blame to any single historian, philosopher, or institution. It is about recognizing a pattern that has shaped how billions of people understand the world, a pattern in which one civilization's story was systematically diminished so that another civilization's story could shine brighter. The cost of this erasure is not merely academic. When we lose the memory of how a vast, diverse empire was held together through tolerance rather than terror, we lose a model for addressing the challenges of our own time. When we forget that human rights were first declared not in Philadelphia or Paris but in Babylon by a Persian king, we impoverish our understanding of where our own values come from. When we reduce an entire civilization to the role of villain in someone else's founding myth, we do not just damage the past, we damage the future, because we cut ourselves off from ideas and examples that we desperately need. The Persian Empire is not a relic, it is a mirror. And for centuries, the West has chosen to look away from it, not because the reflection is ugly, but because it reveals something uncomfortable about the story we have told ourselves. It reveals that civilization did not begin with us. It reveals that the values we claim as our own were practiced by others, earlier and sometimes better. And it reveals that the line between civilization and barbarism was never where we were taught it was. That is not a comfortable truth. But it is the truth, and it has been waiting, in the silence between the columns of Persepolis, for someone to say it out loud. There is a small clay cylinder in a glass case in the British Museum in London. It is about 9 inches long, covered in tiny cuneiform script, chipped and weathered by 25 centuries of existence. Most visitors walk past it without stopping. Those who do stop rarely spend more than a minute reading the small plaque beside it before moving on to the Egyptian mummies or the Greek marbles, the exhibits that the Western world has decided matter most. But that small clay cylinder may be the single most important political document in human history. It is the Cyrus cylinder, and on it, in words pressed into wet clay in the 6th century before the Common Era, a Persian king declared that conquered peoples had the right to their own religions, their own customs, and their own homes. He declared that forced labor was wrong. He declared that temples destroyed by previous rulers would be rebuilt and sacred objects returned. He declared that people who had been deported from their homelands would be free to go back. These were not suggestions. They were policy enacted, enforced, and recorded for the world to see. And they were written roughly 2,200 years before the English Bill of Rights, 2,300 years before the French Declaration of the Rights of Man, and 2,400 years before the United Nations Universal Declaration of Human Rights. The ideas that the modern world considers the foundation of civilized governance, tolerance, religious freedom, the dignity of conquered peoples were not born in Europe. They were born in Persia. And the fact that this is a surprise to most people is itself the clearest evidence of how thoroughly that history was erased. The question that Cyrus posed with his cylinder and with the empire he built around its principles is not an ancient question. It is the most urgent question of our time. Can a vast, diverse society hold together without crushing the differences that make it diverse? Can power be exercised without becoming cruelty? Can a government protect its people without demanding that those people all look, speak, worship, and think the same way? Every modern nation that contains more than one culture, more than one language, more than one religion, is grappling with this question right now. The European Union grapples with it. The United States grapples with it. India grapples with it. And most of them grapple with it as if it were a new problem, as if no one had ever tried to solve it before. But someone did try. Someone built a system that governed 50 million people across 3 continents and dozens of cultures, and held it together for over 2 centuries, not through terror, but through a radical commitment to letting people be who they were. That someone was Persia. And the fact that this experiment is not studied in every political science classroom on Earth, that it is not referenced in every debate about immigration and multiculturalism and national identity, is not just a failure of education. It is a tragedy of civilizational amnesia, a wound that bleeds in ways we do not even recognize because we have forgotten what caused it. The Persian Empire was not perfect. No empire is. There were revolts that were crushed with violence. There were kings who fell short of the ideals that Cyrus established. There were satraps who abused their power and court intrigues that made a mockery of the principles carved into the walls of Persepolis. But the ideal itself, the idea that an empire's strength comes not from uniformity, but from the willing participation of diverse peoples, was something the world had never seen before and has rarely seen since. Rome did not practice it. The European colonial empires certainly did not practice it. Even modern democracies, which claim tolerance as a core value, struggle daily with the tension between unity and diversity, between the desire for a shared national identity and the reality that their populations contain multitudes. Cyrus did not solve this problem permanently. Nobody has. But he identified it, addressed it, and built a functioning system around it at a scale that was not matched for centuries. And then that system was conquered, burned, and written out of the story, replaced by a narrative that gave all the credit for civilization to Greece and Rome and left Persia as nothing more than a defeated villain in someone else's heroic tale. The ruins of Persepolis still stand in the province of Fars in southern Iran. The stone columns rise against a sky that has not changed in 2,500 years. The carved reliefs, those images of nations walking together, bearing their own gifts, wearing their own clothing, honored in their own identities, still line the staircases, weathered but visible, waiting for someone to read them for what they actually say. The wind crosses the platform the same way it did when Darius stood there. The mountains in the distance hold the same silence. And if you stand in that place long enough, if you let the noise of the modern world fall away, you can almost feel the weight of the question that these stones have been asking for 2,500 years. It is not a question about the past. It is a question about right now. What kind of world do we want to build? Do we want one that rules through fear, that demands sameness, that treats difference as a threat to be eliminated? Or do we want one that does what Cyrus tried to do, one that holds diversity not as a problem to be solved, but as the very source of its strength? We claim to want the second. Our constitutions say we want the second, but our history, the history we chose to remember and the history we chose to forget, tells a different story. If we had remembered Persia the way we remember Rome, if we had studied Cyrus the way we study Caesar, if we had taught our children that the first Declaration of Human Rights was written not in English or French, but in Old Persian on a clay cylinder in Babylon, would the world look any different? Could history repeat itself? That is the question, and only you can answer it.